Thanks for joining us for this podcast. We're here in the exhibit hall of the 2022 SBC annual meeting in Anaheim, California. I'm David Rathel. I'm joined here with my good friend, Dr. Chris Chun, who teaches church history at Gateway Seminary. And we're here to discuss Baptist identity, our experience as Baptists who work faithfully in the Southern Baptist Convention, and to kind of share some of our life stories together. And I thought it would be interesting for Chris to lead off for us because when we talk about a Baptist, many people have different ideas associated with that word. Some people think of maybe a church they experienced in their youth where there was a lot of cultural pressure or cultural energy. For other people, when they hear Baptist, they think of a particular denomination in the American South. But when we say Baptist, we mean, yes, a denomination that exists in the South, but something bigger than that. There's an entire Baptist story. There's a set of convictions, theological convictions that go into being a Baptist identity. And Chris has an interesting story about how he arrived into Baptist convictions and being a convictional Baptist. And so I thought it would be interesting to hear Chris's background story here as we lead off.
Well, thanks, Dr. Rathel. Can I just call you David?
Absolutely, friend.
Of course. Hey, so basically I came to a Baptist by interesting story. I wasn't brought up in a Baptist tradition. I have a Korean American background, which means by birth, you're Presbyterian. Just how it works. If you're Korean, you're a Protestant Christian, you're a Presbyterian. So I was brought up in a Presbyterian church like any other good Korean boy would be. But I was always curious about this practice, I might say peculiar practice of infant baptism. It didn't make sense to me because how can an infant be baptized when they're unable to confess their faith? So it was an odd practice, I thought. So during my seminary years, I decided that I need to investigate this for myself. Took classes, read deeply, and thought deeply about Presbyterian understanding of covenant theology. And even though my professors were Reformed persuasion, believe in infant baptism, at the end of my investigation into the matter, I came to a conviction that I shouldn't be baptizing infants. That was my theological conviction. That's going to cause some problem because at the time I was serving in a Presbyterian church and I was certainly fail my ordination exam. So during this time, I came to a conviction, and then it was time for my daughter to be baptized. And this was a fairly young college church that I was serving, and it so happens that my child was the oldest and first child of that congregation, and she needed time for her to get baptized. And the senior pastor, and I was the pastoral staff there, said, "Hey, why don't you baptize your daughter?" And I said, "I don't think I would want to." And then, "What do you mean?" And we had a lengthy theological discussion on infant baptism. And after about 2 to 3 hours of theological discourse concerning infant baptism, approaching from historical angle, biblical angle, to my surprise, the Presbyterian pastor says, "Okay, Chris, you don't have to baptize your child, but you could instead dedicate your child." And I was very happy with that. After that, some of the congregation approached him and said, "Well, can I dedicate my child as well?" And he says, "No, only Chris." So that's how I began my journey there. And then after that, all my network at the time and friends were Presbyterians, and they often take pot shot at me. Some fair, and others not quite fair. We're still friends in a good, loving way. We would take pot shot at each other, and I still was invited to speak at their churches and their retreats. But these Baptists, Chris became a Baptist, right? So, but we still maintain friendship. But I began to feel quite lonely because I left a network of my friends, and then I began to read church history, and I took great comfort in that because I've read people like Anaheim and Justin, who they too left their denomination to become a convictional Baptist. I had begun to fellowship with people like Isaac Backus, who also, Luther Rice, who also left their infant Baptist convictions to become a Baptist. So I began to have fellowship with these Baptist church history figures that who went through the same similar kind of frustration with me. So at the time I was serving at a church in Boston. And after I left Boston to go to Seattle, I began to look for Baptist church to be ordained in. It was a Southern Baptist church in Seattle. And when I found the church and time came for my ordination, I called up my former pastor, who was a Presbyterian. Said, "Hey, pastor, so and so, I decided to become ordained minister at Southern Baptist Church in Seattle." And he said, "Chris, your true color is coming out," and he blessed that effort.
That's hilarious. No, thanks for sharing. I knew you had an interesting story. And as you were making this journey, you're obviously reading through the New Testament, theological works, and as you said, church history works. And so what were some of the most persuasive arguments you found that favored credo baptism? That is the belief that baptism is for believers only and not for infants.
Yes, so first of all, there is not a single instance in the New Testament where infant is being baptized. Now you have these references where you have a household baptism, but what does that mean? Unless you put there's no indication that in Acts, that unless you put a nursing infant there, there's no indication that any reference to infant being baptized. And I think in Eastern culture, which setting up Book of Acts, it's normally that people come to Christ as a family. But when they come together to Christ as a family, they're individually making decision, but and yet collectively making decision as a family and coming to Christ. So I don't really see that in Acts, unless again you make an assumption that infants are being baptized. Now, one other passage that actually I think perhaps the strongest argument from Presbyterian angle is this understanding of covenant theology. In covenant theology, they say that just as you've circumcised infants in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, we should baptize the infants. And the passage that they make a reference is that, how baptism and circumcision is spoken as parallel in the in the Colossians. And when I look at that passage, I do see that parallel, but it does not indicate that somehow baptism has replaced circumcision. I think there is aspect of Old Testament that even talking about the circumcision of the heart. So it's not circumcision that is done in flesh, but in Ezekiel and Jeremiah, talking about the circumcision of the heart. And it's not like the covenant, the forefathers and foremothers, but the circumcision of the heart. In New Testament, in Galatians, circumcision is anything, non-circumcision is anything. What matter is faith working through love. So still in the New Testament, if there is a parallel between circumcision of the Old Testament and baptism in the New Testament, just as a person who are Old Testament who are circumcised physically has entered into the new covenant of circumcision of the heart, which is a new covenant, the believers only known to God, as Augustine would put it, the invisible church. When you bring that to the New Testament, you also had the similar principle working at hand. Those people who have entered the new covenant community with the regeneration, circumcision of the heart, now has grafted into new covenant ratification, which is a circumcision of the heart, which is baptism. Now, baptism, just as the circumcision was an entrance into the new covenant community in the Old, in the New Testament, you have the baptism, the believer's baptism, regenerate church membership. That concept has entered into the covenant of the new, which is comprised of the believer's church.
That's a great segue into the next question I had. We're here talking about baptism, which is appropriate as a leadoff question because it's our practice of baptism that gives us our name as Baptist. But there are other components of Baptist theological identity. And so it's not just a belief in credo baptism. There are other features of Baptist theological commitments, particularly how we order and structure church life. And so maybe if you could talk a little bit about what it means to be a Baptist in terms of the congregation and a membership in a Baptist congregation. What theological principles are in play there?
I'm not sure what you're exactly asking, but let me take a stab at it. And if I've not gotten your question, you could kind of press me more on that issue. Obviously, just in terms of membership, as a Baptist and if we use the circumcision language, which it just has parallel to the baptism of the creedal baptism, you could say that those people who profess Christ, those people who were converted, those people are now worthy of covenant ratification, which is in New Testament believers' baptism by immersion. That how we have been buried in baptism, have been united with Christ, and as Christ has risen, that we're also risen together in Christ. So that is now basis for covenant community, believing community, believers church, regenerate church membership.
Yes, absolutely. No, that's you picked up exactly what I was hinting at there.
Okay.
That's exactly right. So we say baptism is for believers, and then we say from this baptism of believers that we can have a notion of regenerate church membership. The church is comprised of regenerate people, and it's from there that we can say that we are a believers' church. Also from there is our polity, our congregationalism. We're committed as Baptists to a congregational polity, which means that the congregation has a say in the life and governance of the church. The Baptist Faith and Message 2000 famously puts it this way: it's through democratic processes that church leadership is ultimately structured. This in no way negates the office of pastor, leader, elder, but we do believe, because we are regenerate people, that regenerate people are qualified and competent to have a say in church governance. And so just as a person who's been in Baptist life for years, what have you seen in regard to congregational polity? For example, maybe how is it practiced at your church, or what are some of the advantages that you see coming out of congregationalism?
Well, first of all, so I'm really passionate about the believer's baptism upon profession of faith. Regarding the polity, I really don't think that the Bible gives a biblical model. In terms of the subject of baptism, the person who's being baptized, I think Bible is very clear and prescriptive on it. There are different models within the and I'm not sure if the congregational model, although I believe it, is the model, and say that other models are false. Now, having said that, I do think that congregational model has real strength. For example, in terms of how you want to structure the government, there's a lot of leeway. Whatever the congregation decides to do, and in a democratic process, that the congregation is ultimately able to carry that task, whether that delegate that power structure to the pastor, or a board of elders, or a leadership committee, or there's all kinds of different names for how the congregational polity. Some congregations, they vote on every issue. So there is some leeway. That can create confusion, but also that is our strength. Many of the other denominations, say Presbyterians, I know Presbyterian Church International really well, everything's spelled out in the Book of Order. And that's sort of sometimes really shackle you to the type of vision that you might want to carry out in the church ministry and the setting and all. So I really do appreciate the wisdom of congregation. One other thing that's related to this issue is concept of ordination. Many denominations, whether that be Christian Missionary Alliance, Presbyterian or Methodist or any other denomination. It's that the denominations get involved very much and who gets ordained or not. But the thing about it is local church autonomy. It's the congregations that ordains, that minister. Well, for one thing, I mean, in order for you to say become ordained in Presbyterian, you got to pass a rigorous examination by Board of Elder and Presbytery. You have to approve for your ordination and so on and be on call. But they may know, Presbyterian minister might be a very smart guy because they are able to pass some complicated ordination exam, but they cannot vouch for their character in a way that congregational government would. Congregation could come and say, I know this young man since when he was in diaper or when he was rebel in teenager, and then I seen Christ transforming his life, and now he went to seminary or whatever, and now we could vouch for the person's calling in his life. Nobody can vouch for that person's character in a way that congregation could of that individual. So I do think that there is a huge upside in local church autonomy and congregational governance.
No, that makes sense. That absolutely does. Thanks for sharing that, especially from your perspective as someone who was in the Presbyterian world for so many years. And you did help bring a good nuance, I think. We do believe in the Catholicity of the church. That is, we believe in the universal church. The Baptists are not people who have a monopoly on the gospel. And so, as you rightly said, this is not about a false church versus a true church. We believe that our Presbyterians and our Methodists and our Anglicans all can have the gospel, and we love them and we can partner with them in gospel work. This is not a question of true or false church. This is a question of what's a healthy church or what's a well-regulated church according to how we're reading the New Testament. And so it's not a question of the essence of the church, it's a question of the well-being of the church, might be a good way to put it. And so you're right, we want to be very flexible in these conversations, but also convictional in the right ways too. And congregationalism is something that Baptists have to deal with in a variety of different contexts. So as you know, I've been in the South and I've been in rural, small Southern Baptist churches where we did literally vote every time we needed to spend any money in the church. I remember once, this is a true story, it's no exaggeration, someone made a motion that the church needed to spend money to buy more toilet paper in the ladies' bathroom. Well, okay, that's congregationalism to the excess. That's certain things you can put in the budget and just have. But there are other churches that are much larger, who have great confidence in the pastor, who delegate a lot of authority to the leadership team, to the pastor. They very rarely, if ever, vote over the course of an entire calendar year. And so when we say congregationalism, we have to leave that flexibility in place because different churches practice congregationalism in different ways depending on their size, their geographic context, how they want to do ministry. The key for me, at least if this is helpful when I teach class, is that congregationalism never means we vote on everything, but it does mean that the congregation can speak into the life of the leadership team, that they can have a seat at the table, especially on major decisions. Who will you call as your next pastor?
That's right.
Is this person qualified to continue to serve as a pastor if there's something that's been happening? Things like that. So there's a check that's built into the system to preserve, I think, accountability, transparency, and humility. Other facets of Baptist life that you may want to talk about, Chris, as someone who's devoted years of your life to studying Baptist history, Baptist identity.
Right. Other facets.
Or maybe we could even do this, myths about being a Baptist, because we know ourselves as Baptists, but we also know myths that are perpetrated about being a Baptist on the outside of the Baptist fold, and you've stood outside of the world and looked in. And so what are things that maybe are said about us that aren't necessarily true once you come in?
Yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, and then I'll piggyback on what you say.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have unwittingly set myself up for that then. I think one of the myths is that we don't have Catholicity, that we have this very narrow view of the world, and that we think we are the kingdom. And I understand why that myth is out there, because sometimes our rhetoric is not as humble as it should be. And we have had movements in our past that have kind of argued for a position similar to that. I'm thinking of landmarkism, for example. But my experience in Baptist life, literally from being a child up, has not been that way. It's been people who are genuinely committed to the gospel, who want to work with gospel-loving people, both here in America and overseas, They want to cooperate well, and they have their commitments in the right places, but they're also willing to be gracious with people who are also Christians, but who have different commitments.
Right.
And that we all inherit this broader family. And so I think moving forward, that's one of the myths I hope that we can dispel by being charitable and gracious.
Right.
So that's been my experience.
Okay. Well, I could think of another myth. Right now, I'm here at SBC with my class, Baptist Heritage and Practice. They're sitting right in front of me as we're doing this podcast. And one of the myths of being Baptist that I heard, and I hear, this is not true. This is why it's called myth. It's that sometimes people outside of Baptist tradition think that Baptists don't know their history. It's like Presbyterians and Anglican, they have their own sets of hero, and they are proud of their tradition, and they are reading those have gone before them. They're heroes, and oftentimes Baptists are seen as a group of folks that only care about the practical things and don't care about their own tradition. And that is false. That is certainly not the case. I could testify that because I have students right in front of me who care deeply about Baptist history and heritage, and they're here in Southern Baptist Convention to learn about Baptist polity and practice. So yes, we care. We read history. We care about our tradition, and we have Baptist heroes like Anaheim Judson, William Carey, Andrew Fuller. We have our Baptist sets of heroes that we look up to and admire. I could also say that there are a group of Baptists like John Bunyan and William Carey. They forget people in other denominations because people like John Bunyan and William Carey have done such a great things across denomination. Average, like Presbyterian or Anglican or any other people, they forget that these great name of Baptist history are Baptists. It's only when I press them, did you know that they're Baptists? They're like, oh, really? I read Pilgrim's Progress, but I did not know I was reading Baptist. So yeah, I like to tease them on that note. Yeah,
that's great. Another myth that I've seen perpetrated, and again, there's truth behind some of these myths, is that there's no place in Baptist life at all for tradition. And I'm piggybacking on what you just said. And I'm speaking here as someone who's deeply interested in theological construction. How do we move systematic theology forward? And there's some people who would say, well, the Baptists don't have it in their tradition to look back to a tradition. That we're committed to a view of sola scriptura that says you only read the Bible. It's kind of a naive biblicism view of sola scriptura. So you only read the Bible and you don't consult with humility the great councils of the church, Council of Nicaea. You don't consult the doctrinal formulations that precede us. And I have to say, I've not seen that to be true either, because as someone who was raised in Baptist life my entire life, I learned the Nicene Creed. I learned about Chalcedon. I remember in seminary being exposed to those conversations at higher levels, at deeper levels, but that was there. And so I do think that sometimes we don't always get this right, and we can do a better job of it. But we do have a practice in our theologizing of being traditionalist in the right ways, committed to the Bible as primary source of authority, but also considering the testimony that comes from the communion of the saints, all of the saints, including the saints who've lived long before us,
that's right,
who've addressed these issues in articulate and wonderful ways.
Well, if you boil it down, even Baptist Faith and Message, I mean, you read Baptist Faith and Message, but what's under the engine behind Baptist Faith and Message, if you boil it down, say Doctrine of Christ in Baptist Faith and Message, that's essentially Chalcedonian Creed. It doesn't say it, but it is in a very boiled out form without its complex nuances. So we are indebted to this historical tradition of Christian faith without knowing it.
That's very true. We stand on the shoulders of giants.
That's right.
Implicitly and sometimes explicitly.
That's right.
That's right. Absolutely. Any other questions that you might have or wish to bring up? One thing I wanted to ask you, if you're willing to talk about it, is how do you view children in the life of a Baptist church? And obviously people have different opinions on this and you can share how you feel comfortable. But because we're so committed to believers' baptism, that doesn't mean that we're committed to ignoring children in any way, shape, or form. And so what may be practical, we want to end on a practical note perhaps, what practical advice might you have as someone who's now raised 2 daughters on how to train children up in a Baptist context to love the Lord, to pursue after believers' baptism? Because to kind of maybe highlight your work as a father, you've had a daughter here recently who on her own said, I want to pursue baptism.
Yes.
It was a great day.
Yes.
And just kind of maybe the pedagogy in the home.
Yes. Now I need to tread very carefully because I'm in Southern Baptist Convention. So I need to tread very carefully because I'm convinced I probably am the minority view on this issue. So my students here, they're like, okay, what are you gonna say, Dr. Chun? so don't persecute me here. Don't cast any stone. But I'm of the conviction that, and because I come from a Presbyterian tradition, and I'm so committed to believers' baptism, that the people who are baptized really ought to be believers. Now, doesn't mean children cannot be believers. Children can be believers, but but when can a pastor distinguish when that person is believer? Because I could convince a 6-year-old to believe in Santa Claus. I can convince my daughter to believe in God and say the right things. So my daughter I'm especially careful because I'm a pastor. She's raising a pastor home. Everything that she was raised in a Christian home. She was catechized in a Christian home. As far as she's concerned, she has always believed in Christ since day one. So I've taken the approach of, okay, I want to really be careful because, again, God does not have grandchildren, only children, and doesn't mean children are not saved because we don't believe. I think there's the reason, one of the benefit, if you want to put kind of psychological benefit of believers' baptism is that infant baptism is that somehow when my baby dies, if they're baptized, it gives some kind of comfort to the parents that maybe they will go to heaven because they're baptized. That's the whole medieval Catholicism, and that's why in medieval church, even midwives were able to baptize because infant mortality was extremely high, and one of the reasons why infant baptism was a very prominent thing. But as a Baptist, and I see a lot of Baptist churches baptizing a 6-year-old and so on, and I'm scratching my head and saying, okay, so I come from a Presbyterian tradition, so I left infant baptism altogether, and I look at some of the practices, and I'm scratching my head saying, how is that any really different from infant baptism? Is it like children's baptism, or is it infant baptism 6-year delayed? I kind of wonder about that, Again, these are my brothers and sisters in Christ, and I'm sure they want to be part, children want to be a part of, congregation, maybe take the Lord's Supper. Yeah, who wouldn't want a Lord's Supper? It's a snack time in the middle of worship service. I mean, of course they want to do that. They want to participate, but are we just compromising regenerate church membership at the sake of being accommodating? So I kind of raise a question. I don't campaign for it, but at least for me and my family, I have chosen to do it this way. So when my daughter, who haven't been baptized, and at the age of beyond 15, 16, all on her own decide that want to be baptized. And I say, okay. I tell my daughter, do you really want to be baptized? It's not because of me, right? It's like, no. Like, are you sure it's not because of me? Because I don't want anything to do with it. This is going to be your faith. Because you're going to go to secular university one day, and I don't want you to say, I was baptized because my dad wanted me to. I'm making decision to follow Christ on my own. I've decided to follow. That understanding of baptism, when there's all this temptation in secular university, she's able to look back and say, no, I have chosen to follow Christ for the rest of my life. I made a commitment and covenant with the Lord to follow Christ for the rest of my life. She's able to look back. But if she were to baptize when she was 6 years old, she has nothing to look back. It's like, I don't really remember very well. I think I was immersed, or something along the lines. It's a shame. Okay, so when a Presbyterian, who was a person that was raised in a Presbyterian would say, well, I don't remember my baptism. Okay, so of course you don't remember your baptism. You're baptized an infant. You have to take your parents' word for it. But what really grieves my heart is that when a person who was baptized, was raised in a Baptist church as an adult, I don't remember my baptism. I want to be baptized again. That grieves my heart. It's like, who was your pastor? He should have really, catechize you and make sure that you are a believer in Christ, so that you will never have to question whether you are baptized or not when you made your commitment to follow Christ. So that's one of the reasons why I decided to do that for at least my family.
No, thanks for sharing that personal story. And I knew that was important to you. And again, you're not forcing that on anyone. You're offering that as consideration. And so we wanted to end with a practical note here, just as people consider the best way to raise their children, to be good Christians and reflect on the importance of theology.
Right.
And again, our meeting was not a Baptist power hour. We're speaking honestly about our commitments and drawing contrast with fellow Christians, but not in a harsh way, anything like that, just to show our Catholicity. We're surrounded here by bust of Jonathan Edwards, and you're the Jonathan Edwards Center Director at Gateway Seminary. And so we do believe in the Catholicity of the Church as Baptist, and we're happy to partner in the broad Christian family with our Baptist identity in tow with us. But thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Chun, today. Thanks for your work at Gateway. Thanks for the class for coming as well. And thanks to all of you who listen to the podcast.
And before we end, I think yesterday Dr. Sweeney mentioned that there are a lot of work that needs to be done in Edwards studies, and you're the PhD program at Gateway Seminary. Would you like to send some invitation out for PhD students to study Jonathan Edwards and other areas in Christian theology?
Absolutely. I will take every chance I get. So thank you for that. Yes. So I teach Christian theology at Gateway, but as Dr. Chun said, I also direct our PhD and THM degree programs, and we're happy to hear from you. If you have interest in Jonathan Edwards research, we have a great Jonathan Edwards reading room on our campus, great Jonathan Edwards Center, but also research into other fields, systematic theology, biblical studies. We're happy to speak with you, and feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Dr. Rathel.